All right, test. Let's test it. No, just say your name and where you're from.
Kevin Charles Jennings, born Hadley, Suffolk, England, November 1958.
So I guess Kevin, we'll just start out like we did in the kitchen a little bit. Just talk a little bit about your earliest musical influences and how how the England the scene in England was. When you were growing up
Well,
and how the effect that American music and British music had.
yeah. So I mean, my childhood was at the '60s, and it was all about the Beatles. I mean, they had exploded in '62, and that was my earliest memories. Um, were dancing with my parents to those records when they came out, one after the other, and it was everywhere, and it was just kind of universal. Um, like all my aunts, all my uncles, even my grandmother, everybody loved the Beatles. What was not to love about it? It was a fantastic time, um, and you know, everywhere you went, they were all over the TV, they were all over the radio, they were all over the newspapers. You know, as a kid, my dad was a sportsman. He was a footballer in the winter, in those footballing months, and in the summer he was a cricketer. And so we would go watch him play whichever sport, and most of the time we would end up at the pub with all the other, players and their families, and plus in the little town that I was born, there was a pub called the White Hart, which was owned by my mum's cousin, Totty Warren. He was a Londoner, and his wife Iris, and they had this pub, and we would end up a lot there, and of course the Beatles were always on the jukebox in the pub, and that's like I just remember that so fondly. Of course, there was a lot of other really good music all throughout the '60s. After what inspired the Beatles and all the British kids was the explosion of rock and roll in the mid '50s, and so that was still around. Because then there was all the great Motown and R&B stuff that was coming out of America. So it was just, it was a fantastic time for music. And those were my early memories. And then, so around about 1970 was when the sort of the glam rock exploded, or there was a glam rock explosion. People like Bowie, Mark Bolan and T-Rex, Mott the Hoople, Slade was really the first band that changed my life, because they hit in 1970 exact was when they came out with Get Down and Get With It, and they had. Well, they sold as many records as the Beatles did between 1970 and 1976, so I'm told. And I believe it, because I was one of the kids that went out and bought every single as it came out, and they all went straight to number one. I mean, that was just how powerful it was. So, 70, 71, 72, as I turned 13, was when Status Quo were on the radio and on the television, and that was the band that really got a hold of me. And I followed them, throughout the 70s, all over the English countryside and Europe, and that was probably the biggest influence on me. All the way through school until I moved to America in 1978, and Quo was still going strong. They had they went till 1982. They went with the original band had lasted 20 years, because they started in 62 like the Stones. So 82 was when it started going pear-shaped, as they say in England. Um, and but I went back 79, 81, 82. I went back for every Quo tour because I could, and it was easy to fly from New York to London. You could get Freddie Laker Airways for $99 and go, you know, it was a one-way ticket, and it was really easy. But so Quo had really the biggest influence on me, and that was when I really kind of got hungry to be in music. I wanted to be in a band like Status Quo, and I had long hair and all those dreams.
Did you play an instrument?
No, only drums. I played drums naturally because my cousin made me join the Boy Scouts, and I played snare drum in the marching band and did all that. So I always had a good sense of rhythm, and then there was a couple of kids around the town that owned drum kits that I would play, usually better than they did. But I never wanted to be a drummer. I always wanted to play guitar or be the front man. And I never got a guitar until it was way too late. And when I tried, I was quickly frustrated because, like a lot of people, I wanted to be Jimmy Page immediately. I wasn't prepared to do all the practicing, and I just was. It was just not, something I could do quickly. But then, I by the time I came to America, and I still had, a big head of blonde hair, and I thought, well, I'll just front a band, which I'd sort of done a little bit back in Hadley when I was at school. Never played any real gigs, but we rehearsed a lot and we did a lot of talking and, messed about. Liverpool, where the Beatles came from, Liverpool is a port city, and so back in that day, in the middle of the 50s, when Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and Chuck Berry and all the greats had, exploded in America and made records, they were coming directly to Liverpool. That's really key. I learned this years ago in a documentary about the Beatles, but when you think about it, it's just, 1955, there was no internet, there was no really anything. So the records, the imported records, were coming on the ships and, going straight to Liverpool. So the kids in Liverpool got their hands on Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Elvis and that before anybody else in England. So they were ahead of the game, and they were so influenced by it. They took it. They'd never really been a band that had made a huge impact. It was all, solo singers. There was Frank Sinatra, and there were people like that, and like Tom Jones. In England, there was Cliff Richards, but there wasn't. The Beatles were really like the first band. And that was such a huge appeal because there was 4 of them, and they were from Liverpool, and they had these accents, and they were really funny, and they were just so bloody lovable. And, all the girls loved them because they were cute, and they Brian Epstein had smartened them up, and they had really cool, like, long hair that was rebellious, but it was, they were still the good boys until, and then the Stones came along, the bad boys, and there was all that, but it was just completely inspired by, I think, the rock and roll explosion in America, and then Because locally in England, in England there were bands around and that were playing skiffle, like Lonnie Donegan, who was one of my dad's favourite artists. He was like the king of skiffle, and everybody knew who Lonnie Donegan was. He was having hits on the radio. He was on the TV. So they were an influence. But really it was, the Beatles were, well, they just were way above everybody else for a good while. I mean, the Stones came along and caught up, and then they were rivals, but they were best friends, and they were politely taking turns in releasing their singles. So the Beatles are going to put out She Loves You this week, so we'll wait another month, and then the Stones will put out This Could Be the Last Time, and then they just, they were just going back and forth like that. This probably, by 64, 65, when they were both really, taken off, and then of course they came over to America. That was 64, I believe. The Ed Sullivan Show is when the Beatles exploded in America and changed a lot of lives that night. I mean, all the guitar players that I play with now, and I've lots of guitar players that I've known over the years, they all started playing after they saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. And there was hundreds and probably thousands of American males that did that were influenced by that one night on television when the Beatles came on, and it was a momentous night. But 64 was when my grandmother, my Nana, bless her, took me to see A Hard Day's Night. That had just come out, the first Beatles movie, and we went to the pictures to see that with all the screaming girls. And I think that was the same year that my mum dragged me to the Ipswich Gaumont to see Jerry and the Pacemakers, who were a Liverpool band that were a little bit older than the Beatles, so the Beatles kind of looked up to Jerry Marsden. He was the singer, frontman, main songwriter, and they were hugely popular. And all I remember about that was holding on to my mum's hand for dear life in a crowd of Ipswich Gaumont probably held 3,000. It's a small theatre, like the Fox, not quite as glamorous and not quite as big as the Fox Theatre in Atlanta. But I always remember holding on to my mum's hand for dear life while she and 3,000 other women and girls screamed, "We want Jerry!" Because I guess the band were on stage, and he was in the wings, and they were all stamping and clapping and screaming for Jerry, the star, Jerry Marsden. And that's about all I remember. But
do you remember liking his show?
No, I don't remember anything other than being with my mom and all the screaming girls, and they probably couldn't hear, and I probably couldn't hear any music. And that's what the Beatles and the Stones, a lot of the bands in the 60s, especially in the early days, they couldn't even hear themselves play because the girls would just scream, and you couldn't compete with it. Back then, they had little rinky-dinky PAs that I probably got what the Beatles were playing in clubs in the 60s. I probably got more power in my basement, my little amp and pair of speakers. That's all they were playing through. It was.
I think it's interesting that it took the British, the Beatles and the Stones. It seems like it was the British that catapulted rock and roll into a new era. Oh. It wasn't an American band. Why do you think that was?
Well, no, it was. I mean, in a way, because yes, they were bands that did that, but they were all influenced. Don't take anything away from America, because that's where it all came from. Chuck Berry wrote the book Elvis was the king, Little Richard was the queen, and Jerry Lee Lewis was, Jerry Lee. He was the killer. But they started it all. I mean, the Beatles just took it to a new level, and it was repackaged. And like I said before, it was because they were bands. There were American bands around, and they did come forward and obviously had a lot of success too. But that initial phase was the English kids getting hold of American rock and roll, and and just, I mean, they were all cover bands really. The Beatles were playing the same songs as the Stones and the Kinks, even the Who. They were all playing American rock and roll songs. That's how they learned to play their instruments, and that's how they got good. And when the Beatles went to Germany, they were doing like 8 hours a night, and it was probably 6 or more hours of cover songs of whatever they wanted to play, from Fats Domino to Elvis to Little Richard to whatever, blues. They were just learning how to play and learning how to write, I think, and create.
Well, it's just interesting how it wasn't it was the British invasion. It wasn't, even though the roots of it came from America.
Yeah.
It was kind of catapulted into the future by British bands rather than American bands.
Yeah.
And I just think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that was, well, like you said, the British invasion. That was the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, the Kinks, the Yardbirds, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five. They sold millions of records in America. And they don't go down in history. You don't hear people talking about them in particular so much, but they did sell a huge amount of records in a short period of time.
Okay, and then we can jump forward. Now, we're 1978. What made you decide to come to America?
Well, short version would be I wanted out of where I was living. I hated the area that I was raised, where I was born and raised. I'd had a rough time after my dad left my mom in 1968, so my adolescence wasn't a lot of fun. I definitely had fun, but I was troubled, and there was a lot of small town stuff, a lot of bullying and fighting and just small town stupidity that I wanted to get away from. And then I met and fell in love with a beautiful American girl from Connecticut, and so that was like 75. And then 76, she came back to England. Her family was from Hadley. I lived near my mum, and that's how we met. And then by 78, I finally got a visa to come to America, go to Connecticut and visit her and her family. And I was given a 90-day visa to marry her. And we were so young and scared to do that, so we didn't. I got sent back to England. She came back with me, and then we stayed in England for another 4 or 5 months, and we just couldn't stand it. So we got married, and we ran back to Connecticut. And so and Connecticut was all I knew of America at that time. Of course, we went up to Boston, and then we went to New York a lot. And then that was how I ended up in America.
So you guys came, and then what happened after you went to move to Connecticut?
Well, I'd say all I'd ever done outside of chasing status quo and Thin Lizzy and AC/DC around the English countryside. The other thing I did was I played football, soccer, as they say in America. and uh, I was always going to be a footballer, so I thought, and probably most everybody that knew me through school and in the town where I was born, I was I was a local star, and I definitely had the talent, and I had a lot going for me. But my passion for music took over my passion for football, and then when I got to America, there really wasn't. Well, being a professional footballer was not really heard of at that time, and so I came, uh, like wondering what I was going to do. And Liz, my wife, said you should be a bartender, and I was like, that's what I did. So I went and applied for a job, and I got hired immediately because I guess my accent, and I had a bit of wit and charm, maybe. But anyway, this lovely lady, Marie, she was a New Yorker. I remember her fingernails were about 3 inches long, and she was a beautiful elder lady, but she was the one that hired me. And so I got thrown behind a bar in Connecticut in 1978, and that was my undoing, I think. There's a lot of girls, a lot of temptation, and so we'll say that's what ended my first marriage. So then I got kicked out of my life in Connecticut, and that's when things got really interesting, because I had really no idea what to do. So I was 20 years old, 21 in November of '79, and I left the small town that was called Cromwell, Connecticut, and I moved to Hartford, the capital of Connecticut, and I took a couple of jobs in Hartford, and I got a room that was like $10 a week, and I didn't know, because I was still very naive, that it was called a halfway house, which I didn't know what that meant. But I learned, and it was a bit creepy. But I had my own room to entertain, girls. I had a hot plate, so I could boil a kettle and make tea and heat beans and make toast or whatnot. And I lived at like a little swinging bachelor, like 19, 20 years old, and then I had to get out of Connecticut. I was just restless. I went to Boston. I knew some gals in Boston, so I went to Boston, hung out up there for maybe a month or so, and then whilst in Hartford, this is very important. Well, I worked 2 jobs in Hartford. One was a bar called Mad Murphy's, which was really like a mad pub. A lot of fun with live music and a lot of wild people. But I also worked at this very, very snobby, posh men's private club called the Hartford Club. And the owner of the Hartford Club was a German man, Herr Robert Rowe. And one night at the Hartford Club, Robert had a friend from Germany come visit at the club, and he introduced me because this man was a German, he was an ex-professional German footballer by the name of Hubert Vogelsinger. And Hubert was on his way to California to go start and coach and manage the San Diego Sockers, Sockers, which was the beginning of American soccer at that time. New York Cosmos was around, Pele had come over, and there was an interest in soccer brewing in America. Just started. So anyway, Hubert and I had a conversation. I told him my background and where I had played football in England, and he knew I was above average from our conversation. And because I trialled at West Ham, and I'd been, I played at Ipswich Town, and I'd been around. And anyway, he gave me his card, and he said, if you ever get to California, look me up and you can come try out for the team. So I've still got that card, by the way, because that's how I roll. But that was the only thing in the back of my mind. When I left Boston was probably, and I could get my diaries out and tell you the exact date, but would have been spring of 1980, and I had Hubert's card, and I left Boston, and I was thinking at the time that I would go to California, but I was going to go the long way round, because I had met people over the years in England or in Connecticut that lived in other parts of America, and there was a band out of Raleigh, North Carolina called Nantucket, who my wife Liz, she loved that band, and we went to see them a few times in Hartford, and ended up meeting the band and the crew and befriending them. So I had a couple of their phone numbers, and I had a number in Louisiana, I had a number in Texas, I had an address in North Carolina, different places. So off I set from Boston, and I literally had my backpack with like 2 pairs of shoes, a handful of t-shirts, a couple of pairs of jeans, and a Rand McNally map, and I headed south, and that was the beginning of a very interesting journey that led me down the East Coast, where, so I was, 21, right, so I was 21, I was already married, separated, living in a foreign country, homeless. So I got lucky, and I'm very, very lucky that I survived that period of time, to be honest, because hitchhiking on the interstates in America, I found out was pretty scary. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. But I ended up, in North Carolina, and for the summer of 1980, and then on July 26th, I left Charlotte, North Carolina, because I'd gone from Raleigh to Charlotte with these gals to watch this band, and they were playing in Charlotte, and then I had kind of, I think, overstayed my welcome in North Carolina, and it was time to move on. And so I left Charlotte, and my next stop was New Orleans, Louisiana. And if you look at a Rand McNally map now or then, it's exactly the same. There's a big city in the middle of that journey from Charlotte to New Orleans. Right in the middle is Atlanta, Georgia. So I decided, because it was a Saturday, that my goal was to get to Atlanta that Saturday night and see what happened, and like maybe I'd get lucky. Well, that was an understatement because I got picked up off the streets by a couple of gals outside the Georgian Terrace Hotel, opposite the Fox Theatre, next door to the Agora Ballroom, and They literally picked me up off the street and took me into their apartment where I stayed for several months. There's a lot more detail to that story. It was a very, very interesting night, but that was the beginning of me living in Atlanta. And those girls took me in, and I stayed. I never slept with either one of them. I tried, but I never did. And I slept on the floor behind the couch. They had a mattress behind the couch for guests. And so I was parked there for a while. But they took me out that night, and I know the date because, like I said, I kept diaries. I don't know why I kept diaries, I just did. And I'm so grateful that I did, and such a wonderful thing to have them, to look back and I can tell you, 40 something years ago exactly where I was and what I did that day because of those diaries. But landed in Atlanta, and the night of July 26th, the girls took me out to the Agora, and there was a band, an English band called the Mirrors, I believe. Anyway, they were playing at the Agora, and there was a good crowd. And the two girls, their names were Margie and Elaine, and they lived together in the apartments next door to the Georgian Terrace Hotel, the Ponce de Leon apartments. And they were very well connected. I mean, first of all, this is Atlanta, 1980. The music scene was thriving, but it was very small, and people have called Atlanta, the biggest small town in America. I've heard that more than once, and I understand it, because especially since I've lived here now for 40 something years. Anyway, going to the Agora that night, Margie and Elaine introduced me to everybody they saw that they knew, including Rick Richards, which is where my journey began with Rick. And I met a lot of people that night that I still am in touch with to this day. And Rick being the number one of that crew. That's where I met Rick. I didn't see him play till a few weeks later, but after I saw him play, he was in a band called the Desperate Angels, and they were a terrific band, and they were on the verge of breaking through, maybe getting a record deal. They definitely had the goods. There was the frontman and the main songwriter, Tommy Rivers, was really talented. Rick was extremely talented. They had a great sound. They were kind of like the Stones meets Aerosmith. But Tommy had a bit of a drinking problem, and became sort of unreliable and frustrated because they never got that record deal. And that's when Rick started his own band with some other local players, which was Keith Christopher on bass, Brendan O'Brien on guitar, Rick on guitar, and a drummer called Mark Krause. And they called themselves the Famous Unknowns, which I always thought was a great name for a band. And so they started gigging, and because of my friendship with Rick and my affection for him and his guitar playing, I was at all of their gigs, and I'd met, like I said, it was a small town, so I'd already met Keith, I'd already met Brendan, and a lot of the locals, and I became a member of the local music scene immediately. I just fell into it naturally, and because I was English, people thought I was really cool. and it was all really fun and exciting. And so the Famous Unknowns played around for a little while into 1981. I remember, and like I said, I could get my diaries out and tell you all the gigs. They played around. 688 was very popular. There was a place called the Bistro that was fairly popular, late night gig. There was the Agora, which was the big prestigious rock club to play at. But they did the rounds locally, and then by early 1981, it was kind of getting old, and Brendan O'Brien in particular, Brendan had much bigger fish to fry, and he wanted to be a producer, and he wanted a lot more than just being a local, like a big fish in a little pond, so to speak. But anyway, the story goes, the Famous Unknowns were scheduled to play at the Bistro, and it was a Wednesday night, and Brendan called Ricky and said, me and Mark are not coming because we don't want to play that shithole, for $6 on a Wednesday night, right? Because that was the scenario. There wasn't going to be a lot of people there. There was going to be me and the locals, maybe a couple of dozen people, and they wouldn't make any money, and it would be a late night of drinking and whatnot. So Brendan called, said they weren't coming, him and the drummer. So Keith and Rick had been jamming with a guy called David Michelson, who was a drummer, or a man that owned a drum kit, and Dan Baird. And I'd been over to the jams that these guys had in a rehearsal room in Brookhaven. And so that night, Keith called David Michelson, David called Dan, and those two came in and filled in for Brendan and Mark, and that was the first time that they ever played together in a club, and they became, the first set they played under the name of the Famous Unknowns, and at the end of the first set, Keith Christopher, off the top of his head, said, we'll be right back with Keith and the Satellites. And that was how it was born. And I can show you flyers and whatnot from the gigs that Keith and the Satellites did. And that was, I think it was February of 1981. So yeah, these are the diaries that I kept early on. And this is the first one from 1980 that you can see. I just, kept, like, this was when I was in New York. The Inmates played at the Bottom Line. The Inmates were pals of mine from London that had come to New York. I was working on the Porter Bar at the Hartford Club. You could go through this like month by month. Iggy Pop at Stage West, March the 1st, and that was in West Hartford. Humble Pie at the Shaboo in Willimantic. Pat Travis in New York at the Palladium. I remember that night I was chatting up a girl, this beautiful blonde. I was backstage because I had made some friends that were connected, and so I was backstage at Pat Travis at the Palladium. And Pat Travis was a big star at that moment in time. And so I was chatting up this bird, a beautiful blonde, her name was Cricket. And she gave me her card, and I thought I was going home with her until somebody told her that bloke over there, the good-looking one with the long hair, was Ace Frehley from Kiss without his makeup. So she took off with him. But you know, there's just so much stuff in here, and you know, this is June. I was in North Carolina and hanging out with the Pedestrians and Nantucket and Mother's Finest and all these bands. July, that's the day I landed in Atlanta, July 26th. Atlanta, the Agora, 688, Margina Lane. And yeah, that's like I said, that was that night, and then I'm, you know, going on through the rest of 1980, and and then there's 1981, and you know, I think beginning of the Famous Unknowns at the Agora. Yep, Saturday, January the 3rd. Cheap Trick at the Fox, and then that was an amazing night, because the Romantics, who were in the charts at the time, they were from Detroit, I think. The Romantics played at the Agora, and the Cheap Trick came across the street from the Fox to the Agora, and at the end of the night they joined the Romantics on stage. So it was all the Cheap Trick and all of the Romantics, and they did This Could Be the Last Time. They did Route 66, and then Rick Nelson, the Cheap Trick, rolled up his trousers so they were shorts and started impersonating Angus, and they did Highway to Hell with Robin Zander singing it, and it was unbelievable. That was that night. Yeah, so I could, like I said, I could talk about these for ever. I mean, and obviously I kept more detail. The Unknowns, Famous Unknowns at the Agora, again, that was March. George Thorogood at the Agora. I know I saw Thin Lizzy down there too. But anyway, this is, you know.
And were you still bartending at the time?
Yeah. So I bartended his 1982, 1983. You know, and then about 1984, I started the big books, and they're all over there. But back up weed. I got that. I'll show that one dryer, but yes. So from then on, you see. Oh boy. Oh, there. Oh my God. Well. Okay. So moving on, like I said, 83, that's 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, you know, these just, those 85 when I toured with Jason and the Scorchers, Satellites, this was 88, this is 89, yeah, so I mean, that's like I said, these are the big books, and I kept the shows, all the song lists, every mistake they made, everything good, bad, and ugly, and fun that happened in those years are all in these books. You know, I mean, like I said, it's amazing that I kept all them, and I'm glad I did. I always enjoyed doing it. All of this stuff is, you know, from back in the day. I mean, starting. This is pretty much chronological. This I showed you that the other night. That's a picture of REM at and I looked it up. It was April 26, 1980 in my diary. It was a Monday night. I told you it was like penny beer night. And that's me dancing with a girl called Gretchen. And that's REM. And they're on the dance floor and we're on the stage. We kind of swapped places. And then shortly after that picture, I took the mic from him and I sang Gloria. Because he was mumbling the words and I was drunk enough to grab the mic and do it properly. But anyway, this is the Desperate Angels. That's Ricky and Tommy Rivers doing the Jagger Richards look, but that's Rivers Richards. That was one of the first pictures of the satellites in the Creative Loafing, 1983. That was the lineup. 1984 with Dave Hewitt playing bass, and that's what Morrow joined, Morrow Magellan, with a really bad 80s haircut. But yeah, these are all bits and pieces from the 80s and guitar picks, and just there's a lot of stuff up there. And then of course there's just goes through the years. Since we're getting to the satellites, these are Scorchers, those satellites passes, all of the tours. This particular napkin that is well, it's not framed, but it's you can see that. So 1984, the Hellhounds, which was Rick's band. So we should probably back up because we're jumping the gun.
That's all right. We can wait.
Yeah.
So look, could we touch back on this real quick?
All right.
Yeah, I see you got a picture of Johnny Rotten. Can you tell me about? Were you a fan of the Pistols? And
yeah. Plus, I favoured him, and I've spent time with a couple of gals that thought I was Johnny Rotten, and I just played along. One time, that was up in Albany, New York. These two girls I met backstage at a David Johansen concert, and that would have been 1980, and they thought I was Johnny. Everybody thought I was Johnny Rotten backstage, and these girls came up and asked me one of them asked me if I was, and I said, no, I'm not. But she goes, well, just pretend you are, because my friend will do anything. And so I played along and I had some fun, put it that way. And then another time I was in Australia when a girl bought me flowers at a bar because she thought I was Johnny Rotten.